See if I can figure out the microphone here. Well, thank you, Chad, very much. My name is Andrew Hansen. I'm the program director at Anselm House, and I have the pleasure to lead us into the more interactive portion of this evening. And to start that out, I have the great privilege of introducing someone that requires very little introduction here on campus, the University of Minnesota's Executive Vice President and Provost Karen Hansen. Provost Hansen is the Chief Academic Officer for the entire University of Minnesota system, a position that she's held since 2012. She knows the university very well firsthand, having earned her BA in philosophy and mathematics from the U. From Minnesota, she went on to Harvard University, where she earned her PhD in philosophy in 1970. And given this expertise in both the humanities and, again, as the Chief Academic Officer guiding the academic mission here at the University of Minnesota, we are truly honored to have Provost Hansen with us to comment on, discuss tonight's lecture. And so I'm going to turn it over now to Provost Hansen to comment on what you heard from Chad, raise any questions that you want to.
Thanks very much. Well, I found myself in agreement with much of the position you staked out at the end. But there may be a sort of sensibility difference I'd like to explore a little bit. There is a sort of thread of disappointment running through your narrative about what you had been expecting from the university, from humanities courses, that I honestly can't feel myself. And so I'd like to know a little bit about that, about what view you have of thinking, you know, the activity of thinking, that finds it not fully satisfying, you know, that there's something missing, even if what one learns in university and is thinking well along certain disciplinary lines. You know, why do you end up disappointed, given the gift of discipline and rigor that one can find in humanistic disciplines?
Yeah, I think the simple answer to that is that I never got to the thinking well as a good in and of itself until well after grad school. And that has a lot to do with, you know, where I came from, and I think it also has a lot to do with the expectations that were projected by me and by a lot of the professors who were very important to me in undergrad, especially, that thinking well was a means to some other more grandiose, morally transformative end. And it wasn't until, you know, quite honestly, I started finishing my first book and really became a scholar in my own right. You can see a relationship between those, that I realized that thinking well is a practice. It has goods internal to it, and they don't have to be immediately subordinated, and they don't have to be weighted down with, I'm not quite sure. I mean, I tried to give an account of some of the weight, the onus that was put on them, but I had never learned, you know, I had never been fully absorbed, I don't think, into the activity of thinking until I got out of graduate school. And I had obviously, given, you know, what I was able to do, I had obviously managed to think well in some ways. I'm not suggesting that. But just in terms of a meta account of how I related to it, I always was disappointed because I thought to think well should have the following results, right? It should be, you know, it's no coincidence that, you know, my first book was, you know, largely on early German Romanticism, right? I mean, there are threads to the, you know, the bristling at this purported disenchantment of the world through all of that. But just simply said, I had never been satisfied and taken pleasure in thinking well because I thought, morally speaking, it was insufficient. Does that make sense? It's a very personal thing, and it's a stance that I had I think I've had to disabuse myself of.
It does make sense, but I'm really wondering, you prefaced it by saying that it was something that you thought had been held out as a possibility by your teachers. But I'm wondering if in fact it wasn't something that was already deep-seated in and that you've disclosed by the narrative of your growing up, and that it really wasn't in the way in which, wasn't evident in the way in which the humanities were being practiced even by your teachers.
I see. No, absolutely, right? I mean, that's, the story of my father is that, any sort of reading was absolutely instrumental, to the redemption. It was completely incidental to the eschaton, right? To put it in grandiose terms, right? And so your question is, in my narrative, it points, I'm trying to identify those points where I projected that notion of what reading was as a practice onto every text, onto every classroom, and eventually onto the humanities, right? So that's on the one hand. And I would say, and I only mentioned it very briefly, I would say, as scholar Chad, that's actually a persistent narrative kind of in the invention of the modern humanities since like the late 19th century, the way they've been cast institutionally. So there is the very personal one, and I've only realized that in the book I'm finishing now is called Permanent Crisis, the Humanities in a Disenchanted Age, and it kind of traces these overblown reactionary expectations over the course of 19th century Germany and then over the 20th century in the United States when the humanities became an institutional category. So there is that institutional history, but yeah, it's absolutely grown out of the, my what I thought reading had to ultimately end in, that then got projected over everything I touched, and I'm sure on every teacher I encountered. Is that more?
Except that I do think there's a story to be told there, and I'm glad you're telling it in another piece of writing about expectations of 19th century universities. But I actually was also somewhat surprised by the way in which you cast the discourse in humanities as involving a lot of justification in terms of personal testimony. I've got to say, that was not my experience.
Well, you're a philosopher.
Yeah.
Which is, no, I mean, which, as you know, the NEH is one of the few, granting agencies that routinely funds philosophical research. It's a very different, I would argue, a very different discourse, both historically in terms of its presuppositions. It makes perfect sense to me, and I think so I'll just stop right there. But it makes perfect sense to me that this could be confounding my philosopher friends that across the country also don't. Well, it depends on where they were trained. Typically don't. They have zero patience for any sort of claims of this sort. It is much more about the thinking well.
Well, it's just that what I also heard was almost what I'd call a reactive cynicism to the failure of the disciplines to produce the sort of satisfaction that you're longing for. But you may be making a call that it was never appropriate to make. I mean, there are different ways of engaging in those enterprises where what one is looking for is, say, clarity or even peace, but not necessarily transcendence. And you're quite right that particularly those of us trained in analytic philosophy are looking for clarity. But that may also be a matter of sensibility.
I think so, and I think to me tonight is the first time that I've tried to own up to that, not own up, to get clarity about that sensibility, and but it's a sensibility on the one hand that is distinct, but it's also a sensibility that, in my experience, is kind of riven across certain understandings of the university and the humanities. In particular, this expectation that they must do, they must impart values, not just epistemic values or virtues, clarity of thought. That's much too low-hanging fruit, I think, for a lot of folks. But humanities talk makes claims about they will make us more democratic, more empathetic. Even somebody like Martha Nussbaum will make arguments about this, and she's a philosopher perhaps of a different ilk. But I even
in the same department.
Yeah. But I would imagine maybe. But I mean, even those claims I find in the same kind of category. What literature can do for people, it's incomprehensible to me now. But long ago, I would have fully agreed. But now, when I read, especially how our arguments are taken up among literary scholars as justification of, look, we make people more empathetic, the causal relationship is much more complicated.
Well, I agree with that it's much more complicated, but I wouldn't see the territory right away that clarity and peace aren't actually in some way to be related to a kind of moral transcendence of a different sort. I guess you also suggested that society, or at least in the circles in which you were moving, or that what you saw of common judgment was deferential to humanistic disciplines. I've got to say, I don't. That's not my experience at all. That we would expect that people would expect that people who are experts in the humanities could give us guidance. I have the sense that the public as a whole sort of thinks,
yeah.
I can do that as well as anybody else.
Oh, no. I meant, sorry, and at that point I didn't. I was meaning the broader research university as a whole, the notion of discipline specialized knowledge, which we were more familiar with the sciences, but the arguments you're seeing coming forth from humanists today, like people like Christopher Newfield or Jonathan Kramnik, these are literature scholars. I think it's important, is that they have turned sharply against precisely this kind of wisdom monopoly thing that the humanities have sometimes claimed, and they're arguing precisely that no, that literature is a very specific kind of knowledge, and that a modern society needs it, which I find is a fascinating, both historically, but also along the lines that you're discussing. It is precisely the sense that no, everybody knows that the whole, say, empathy game or wisdom game is not the sole purview of humanistic disciplines. And so the argumentative stance is now that we provide a special knowledge that nobody else can. I mean, we can talk about and adjudicate those claims, but it is, I think you point to something, a crucial shift in how some humanities scholars are justifying and conceiving of their work.
Well, let's go back to your view about the role that that training in the humanities or in any of the kind of humanistic disciplines, the role it might play in the formation of moral character. I mean, it's a cliche about the Nazi who listens to opera and reads Goethe.
It's when we too quickly forget.
Right, but it's true.
Exactly.
There's a reason it's a cliche.
Yeah.
But against that, I think many people have the experience of thinking that through books and literature, they've widened their world and hence enhanced their sense of sympathy and the capacity to connect with others. There's nothing that guarantees it. But there again, what I would think, it's the analytical philosopher in me, but I would think that it's this sort of expectation that there would be some transcendental way of ensuring it that leads you to be disappointed there. Whereas someone influenced by, I don't know, a more kind of empiricist philosopher might say, That's good. That's progress. In general, if you read literature and it enhances your sense of how people live, what they care about, how they feel, how they might be harmed or helped emotionally by certain circumstances, in general, that's a good thing and enhances your capacity to be a moral being.
Oh, no, I definitely agree with that. And I think part of the story I was trying to tell was that it took me a while, because of where I came from and the disposition, in which I'd been shaped, to have those expectations of any kind of reading encounter, that I had to be disciplined into that. And, as I tried to end saying, that I think what we have to offer is the pursuit of a clarity of thought, which can entail a whole host of kind of small n norms and small g goods, of the type that you just talked about. But you're right. I overburdened, every text and every expectation of a university and an institution. And I think, as I've come to work on these things, both historically and gain a bit more clarity about them also for myself, I see those expectations all over universities, and the temptation, and it's a rhetorical temptation, kind of in public settings, on deans, but also professors and all the endless op-eds about the value of the humanities. The temptation is to promise more than they could ever deliver, of the kinds of things that I, as a youngster in a sense, I had to grow up. I mean, basically that's what I had to grow up. But I think we as a profession are still all too often tempted to make those kinds of claims and not recognize the good that is thinking well in the most basic of senses, because that's a damn hard thing to do, right?
Yes,
to think
yes,
well.
it is.
And I would be completely satisfied if I were ever able to do it, much less that the students whom I love could ever do it. So absolutely, it was it was a longer process for me to, not necessarily to learn to think well, but to learn to find a certain satisfaction, and then now, importantly, given my position now, to stand up and defend it, as not just an individual proclivity, but as a social good. Does that make sense?
It really makes sense. I would just hope that you wouldn't fence off the idea, though, that it's just thinking clearly. I do think that in extending the range of experience through humanistic texts, experiences in plays, music, and so on, that you could also extend your sensibility so that it's more than just rigor of thought. And again, no guarantees. There's the Nazi who loves the opera.
No, I'd be perfectly, not just concede, I'd be perfectly willing to embrace the notion of an expanded sensibility. I would be much more skeptical of a stronger kind of moral claim along the lines of something like empathy, sympathy, solidarity. I would put those kind of on sensibility is vague enough not to commit yourself right to the moral force of something like kind of a robust and sustainable empathy. But point taken, and definitely.
But then how does one learn empathy? I mean, in part, you really don't expect a 2-year-old to be as empathetic to sophisticated and subtle emotions as you would somebody who's 20 or 40, 50. Presumably there are life experiences of learning that, and including the way people behave, the way people react, and some of those you get yourself in your direct experience, but why can't it be that some of those you get through literature, for example?
Yeah, no, I think I would say you could, but I think you would get it through a clarity of thought about literature, not just by immediately reading a novel.
Sure.
So literature qua university way of reading literature, in a sense, right? And in the sense that it has to be done in a setting with others and with a bit more care than kind of the ad hoc reading we might do elsewhere. That might be possible. You have to learn to read well, is basically all I'm saying, in order to make those kinds of goods possible.
And I
would
guess
say.
I shouldn't say this from within, given my day job,
Yeah, yeah.
but I don't think that necessarily has to be within the university setting. I mean, I do think that people can, good readers, and might be able to get it even without the help of a literature course.
Oh yeah, no, but you have to, like I had nobody. I only had my dad's way of reading. I had to, somebody had to train, somebody had to teach me how to read well, and I'm eternally grateful for that. That's all I meant by that. And yeah, some of the most exciting, things I think happening, quote, in the humanities now, are the literature and philosophy and prison programs that are going on. The work Danielle Allen did when she was at Chicago, and the work people are continuing to do, is, for me, it's some of the most exciting ways to think more deeply and also challenge the presuppositions that somebody like me, who's in a university, might have just about those things. But she's in there, she's teaching, folks who've never read Plato, how to read, basically. And they're, from what she says, like, astoundingly quick learners. And because, partly what you said, the life experiences that they can immediately bring to the text, that she's able to focus and cathect in a certain way.
Could I ask a follow-up to, so one of the proximate goods, I think, Chad, that you mentioned that the university can provide, or maybe the humanities in particular, is articulation of ultimate concerns. So you brought up that the university can't give us definitive answers on sort of questions of ultimate concern, motivation, fundamental conviction, but you did say that it can train us to articulate those wells and to think about what those are for us, and also to understand those of other people. I'm curious, Provost Hanson, if you would agree with him in that function of the university, and how that has perhaps informed the grand challenges as we've been thinking about the strategic vision. How do those questions of articulating ultimate motivation come into the strategic plan?
Well, let me answer it in a personal way first, rather than qua strategic plan implementer, because I agree about that, but I also, again, I also agree. I don't think it's the place of the university to do that. But part of what also underlines, and I think for me provides a foundation that leaves me not hungry for the kind of transcendental backing that you're looking for, is I have a much more Deweyan view of values, that they're discovered in the world, that there's a sort of continuity between fact and value, that they're revisable, that there can be a kind of progressivism about our grasp of values. So I think I don't think it's the place of an institution to, like a university, to promulgate a fixed set of values. I do think there are constitutive values without which it can't operate, which is part of the point you're making. And they're very, very important. They're not everywhere evidenced in every segment of our society. And those are the things that allow us to make this progress through the individual discovery of what makes our life meaningful. And that's, I think, one of the other things that I want to kind of throw into the hopper of what Chad has been saying, that part of what we're searching for is meaning in our lives, and that may vary from person to person, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's another reason why an institution as multidimensional as our university can't be the one who's saying this is the one path you should be following.
Yeah, no, and I would. I think being frank about, call them the moral limitations, the moral, what did I say? Kind of the chastened sense, not demanding kind of ultimate bedrock, values that are some kind of eternal. That allows, I think, at its best, recognizing that, being frank about that, but also vigorously defending the virtues and practices that it can promise and in a sense guarantee, that does put the university, sometimes it happens, sometimes it doesn't, at a unique, culturally speaking, a unique advantage as a space in which, I have 300 students in the residential college at UVA, and they are just a giant cross-section of Northern Virginia, which is one of the most diverse populations in the country, and then the rest of the country. And the kinds of conversations and the kinds of commitments that people bring, into class and into our living room, and when we're talking about, 2 weeks ago it was the Kavanaugh hearings, a science fiction novel. Next week, at its best, again, acknowledging that just because we fail to meet that sometimes doesn't make this a false claim, right? It's very exciting, but there's also a profound value, not just for my students, but also for me personally. And so I think that's crucial why the university needs to be frank about these kind of limitations, not to overpromise, but then just as much to the mat defend vigorously the virtues and the practices that we have been cultivating for quite some time.
And maybe as a follow-up to that, Chad, do you see those virtues and practices within the university as self-sustaining in some way, or do you think they have to draw from resources outside of the university? In some ways, it's a similar question to is democracy, are the values that uphold democracy self-sustaining?
Yeah, you can answer the question about democracy. I think in one way, no, they're not self-sustaining, but I mean in the following way. I mean that, when I step on campus, just like any of my students, I'll talk about my students, when they come as 18-year-olds on campus, they've been leading, these morally robust lives for 18 years. They've been formed in all kinds of ways that I will never even know. They're only kind of in my space for 4 years. So I think it would be naive of me to say that they're not bringing in all kinds of commitments that I can try to get clarity about, like work with. I mean, that's a big part of my goal, is to try to help them better understand on their own terms, what they're actually committed to and what they hold most dear. But also that goes for me too. Like, I bring my commitments to my work. I think this is kind of the most naked example, right, of what I talked about tonight, of the confused commitments that I have brought to my work. And I mean, it's the reason I've been writing about the Research University for the past 5 years, to try to make sense of this. And that's something, as I tried to acknowledge, that began long ago, right? So in that sense, I don't think the university's kind of practices are self-sustaining, because we all come as people with desires and loves from all different ways. And at its best, I think the university can draw so much of its strength from that, without kind of the pretense that it was Rawls. I get Rawls must have been he was when you were of course without trying to be a caricature version of kind of a Rawlsian liberal, right? That he's been made into a whipping pole for. Does that make sense? That we can be. The conversations are just more interesting when we don't fully check ourselves at the door. And I think many of us, or I'll speak for myself, I've made the mistake of doing that too often, because I was not quite sure what this thing called the university was.
And as a follow-up for Provost Hanson to that point, I've talked to a lot of, mainly just because of my work, Christian students, faculty that are exactly in that position. They sort of check their religious motivations, kind of fundamental convictions at the door, I'd say mostly because they struggle to know how to articulate them well and appropriately in the university setting. What advice, Provost Hanson, might you have for students that bring those religious convictions into the university space? What is sort of appropriate articulacy of those, like being honest about the ways that those are motivating and maybe even framing their understanding? What does that look like?
Well, I'm not sure I have a general answer to that, but I think it's an important question. You can wrestle with that in a variety of ways, even if it isn't a matter of your religious convictions you're bringing into it. I mean, when I was teaching regularly, I often taught moral philosophy courses and including intro ethics courses that might have been, contemporary moral problems or something like that. I had a view about every single one of the problems that we talked about. It would be capital punishment, abortion, lots of things, euthanasia. My students never knew what my view was, because I was convinced that pedagogically the right thing to do was to be able to present arguments on both sides, get the students to engage with me, keep giving arguments back to them no matter what they said, so that they would have the capacity to own their own thoughts on these things, that they weren't thinking what they were supposed to be doing was getting a text. But that's a sort of simple answer. The question is, how are your deepest convictions relevant to what you're doing? I mean, I'm convinced to this day that in a course such as that, my job is to get students to think better about matters of fact and value. And that the way I do that, particularly when I'm dealing with undergraduates, is not to allow them to have a teacher as an authority figure, but as a prod. And so there's a technique for that. That doesn't mean, I think, that you check your values at the door or you check your convictions at the door. There are other ways in which those could be playing a role in the things you do, in the way you structure your class, and in the interchanges you have with people. Those are part of your identity, and I don't think, I think it would be self-deceptive to be thinking you're checking them at the door. But there's a difference between that and proselytizing.
But perhaps in a course on sort of just society and thinking about what justice looks like, finding those ways to articulate where those motivations, those kind of fundamental concerns are coming from would be part of it, right?
Yeah, I mean, it would be self-deceptive to say you're not choosing certain texts for the class or taking up certain topics because...
And I should say, I'm thinking more of the student in that context than the... Because I think the professor's in a different situation pedagogically, but the students would be trying to bring to articulation, I think as Chad said, what those fundamental convictions are, right?
Well, and as they should be. I mean, they should be saying what it is they have it at heart to say. And they should be testing those convictions, which are, in my view, often shot through with values, against the rest of the discourse in the class. And they should be reflecting, but they shouldn't be hiding a portion of themselves, particularly a portion that inflects their sensibility and their judgment in the rest of life. And that would be very sad.
Yeah. No, to add to echo, I think what I understand you to be saying a great deal. To play kind of like the historian, I think, for example, Max Weber's purported value, free judgment. I think we've understood it terribly. I would translate it more as like the freedom of judgment, and it's fundamentally, I would argue, a pedagogical principle. Like anytime he talks about kind of, Wertfreiheit, or what is poorly translated as value neutrality, it's always about the professor at a lectern, right? It's always situated in a classroom or a lecture hall experience, and it's it's a moral imperative to do just what you were talking about, right? It's a maletic experience. You're trying to nurture a clarity of thought. Like, so the students, you're trying to help them recognize those commitments that you're talking about, but then you also demand something of them, right? A clarity and a force of articulation, which I would imagine, at least that was my case, had never been demanded of them before. And then for me, and maybe this, one of the ways I would articulate it is out of my confessional commitments, and I really do. I feel called to love them, and the way I've been called to love them vocationally is to do just that. Is to the best of my ability to help nurture that clarity of thought, and of course, the same way, I'm going to teach particular books, particular courses. I'm going to write particular things because of my kind of commitments, absolutely. But when it comes to teaching, Weber one day, Nietzsche or Rawls the other day, that task at hand, the way I love my students, is I take on, the arguments in that text and defend them to the best of my ability. I feel that's my calling. That's what I owe my students. And to me, so much of this is it's almost pedagogically prosaic, right? What it's about is what we do in the university, which is education and thinking. But it's difficult, and it doesn't always happen.
Well, we want to have time for some of your questions, but I also want to see if Karen has any further comments or questions for Chad before we move to audience.
Well, I'm happy to hear the audience question.
All right. This is going to be a little bit challenging because the lights are so bright up here that
We can't see
we're
you.
just sort of staring into darkness. So we do have a couple of microphones coming around. If you could raise your hand high, and one of our staff members will find you with the microphone. Just a couple of ground rules about asking questions. Please do ask a question, not make a comment. And please try to keep it as brief as possible just so we can get through as many questions as we can.
Provost Hanson, I really appreciated your responses and enjoyed certainly Chad's comments tonight and personal reflections. My question is, with regard to your comments, Provost Hanson, that the university should not articulate one way of understanding values understood clearly. But I wonder if we don't have a responsibility in our universities to expose students to a range of values in a systematic way. In other words, in the first year or two that undergraduates are in the university, is it not unreasonable to expose them to a range of values and exploring the big questions so that they have at least some structured way to do it across the university, not just in philosophy classes?
Well, I do think we have a responsibility of that sort, and I'm not sure I understand quite the force of not just in philosophy classes. I mean, I think that in lots of fields of study, the choices that are made in how material is presented, what kinds of texts are chosen, and so those are reflective of values too, and the texts often raise issues that people end up debating. I can say that when I was 18 years old and starting college, the first time that I took I think the first philosophy course I took was a logic course. Good, fine, so that was interesting. But the first time I took a moral philosophy course, I thought, you could really, this is what you could think in a disciplined way about these matters. I was so interested in those matters, but kind of not knowing how to go about forming my own views at that point. And I can't say how important that course was for me. And it wasn't that I then thought, I'll study more of this. It was that I learned a certain kind of rigor of thought about matters that before had seemed to me tremendously important, but where I felt fuzzy. And I think that the values that underlie clarifying thought can be there in any sort of subject. And that is one of the ways in which we present a range of values. I mean, if you think about a course in biology, I'll go back to your Grand Challenges thing. One of the Grand Challenges courses taught on this campus is, can we feed the world without destroying it? You know, where people are, a number of professors are bearing down from different disciplines on the issue of agricultural production and natural resource conservation and the duties we owe to generations beyond our own. I mean, the questions that they're asking from their perspectives of ag and biology and natural resource sciences and so on are shot through with values. So I do think we have that responsibility in our curriculum, and I think we meet it in a variety of ways. We're talking right now on this campus about our liberal education requirements, trying to see whether or not they should be revised. It's been about 10 years that they've been what they are. And people are wrestling with that question about how to infuse the curriculum, which involves so many competing things, really desiderata that students want to learn a lot of things, but an interest in how values bear on any area of knowledge, I think, is something that is attended to in more courses than you might think.
Chad, would you have anything to follow up on that in terms of educating students across a breadth of moral convictions, values?
Yeah, the new general education program that I lead at UVA is trying to do that. I'm not sure if we're successful. So, for example, to be particular, we have one of our best astronomers. She teaches it's first-year only course. We have 4 required courses or categories that people have to take: ethics, empirical investigation, difference in aesthetics. But she's teaching a course on the beauty of the cosmos, right? And it's an empirical course, but she's very upfront about her desire as an astronomer for a particular good, which is order, right? The desire to see symmetry. Like, that's how she understands her vocation as an astronomer. And it's very different from how, like, a literary scholar might desire to see beauty and symmetry. But to me, I take that to be a core. It's not a political value per se. It's not, a religious value per se. But she understands her vocation as an astronomer as in search of a well-ordered cosmos. And we understand that well order very differently, when we're not in the classroom. But it's a value that she seeks, and she's trying. That it's also a value, according to her, that was kind of formed in her as a graduate student in astronomy. A desire for the beautiful coherence of a mathematical description of objects out there. I don't know if that's a value you're talking about, but I take that to be a crucial value for my students at UVA to get, not just from somebody teaching poetry, but from a scientist. Because one thing that does for me is it shows students that scientific pursuits are not simply instrumental, right? That they are fundamentally liberal as well. Like, there's a good in that pursuit that doesn't have to be immediately, turned into economic value, although it can be. But there's a liberalness to astronomy just as much as there is to poetry.
I think we'll have time for one more question here, but we will have time for more conversation afterwards.
I have a question for Chad. I appreciate, I'm over here in the middle, very much appreciate your recognition of sort of a clear and rigorous thinking as what the university can properly offer to students. But I guess my question to you would be about the flip side of that. Is it part of the ends of the university to teach what the limits of critical and rigorous thinking, to help students think about what critical and the questions that critical and rigorous thinking may not be able to answer, and is recognition of that properly part of a university education, and if it is, how do you incorporate that? I mean, I imagine you do in some ways try to incorporate that into your teaching. How do you do that?
Right. I would twofold. I'll answer kind of the broader Untitled Chapter kind of way question second. I don't mean to say by embracing kind of clarity of thought that there's not riven through the modern research university a charismatic thread, right? There absolutely is. I would imagine, definitely for myself, but I'd project on you as well that there's a passion, that there's a drive, there's a commitment that you also just love, those moral questions or whatever you studied, right? It's not simply the distanced, we have something at stake in this, right? So I don't mean to suggest that, but also, just as part of the, in a sense, curricular or research program, absolutely the limits to empirical forms of knowledge. In fact, again, just to use, because it's kind of straightforward and pedantic, the new gen ed program that I run, we have these principles kind of accorded with each of the 4 categories, and I think the third one is after learning to appreciate kind of inductive forms of reasoning and learning to appreciate how data is always gathered, created, and organized, is recognized, and then also to ask what are the limits of empirical forms of knowledge. How do you describe those? How do you encounter them? And that they're the kind of the mundane ways of talking about that, which is recognizing the kinds of questions that this one discrete data set can actually help you answer versus the kinds of questions you might project onto it, that kind of thing. But also, to make arguments for, so my mathematician friends, they were peeved when the way we had initially written kind of the empiricism section of the curriculum, and also my metaphysician friends in the philosophy department, and the logicians as well, they were peeved, like, we don't have anywhere to go because we don't consider our work, strictly empirical. And that was a kind of a great faculty conversation. How do we make room for these other forms of knowledge, right? And it doesn't always have to be, it's either empiricism or it's, mystical thinking, right? There can be deductive forms of reasoning. There can be more different kinds of math that a lot of my mathematician friends were doing, theoretical physics, that they didn't see themselves, in these descriptions of empirical forms of knowledge. And that was, again, just a kind of a mundane way to think about these types of questions, but has big institutional consequences. Yeah.
Well, before I turn things back over to Casey, would you join me in thanking Professor Wellmon and Provost Hanson?